Welcome to the channel Stories Around the Campfire. This is a place to slow down, listen to stories, and rest from the noise of the day. If this kind of atmosphere speaks to you, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from.
March arrived in the village quietly, not with warmth, but with a subtle shift. Something felt rather than seen. The ground had released its frost, yet it had not softened. It held moisture deep inside, breathing it out slowly, as if unsure whether winter had truly gone. The road between the houses lay dark and uneven, scarred by old wheels and footsteps. Shallow puddles reflected the dim evening sky, stretching it thin across the earth. The air carried familiar scents: damp soil, old wood, a trace of smoke lingering from afternoon fires. Thomas stepped outside his house and gently closed the door behind him. He did not rush. Evenings like this never asked for haste. This was the hour when the day loosened its grip, when shadows lengthened along fences and gardens, brushing against bare apple trees whose branches already held unseen life. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. A gate creaked, then settled. The village lived quietly, as if careful not to disturb itself. Thomas began walking without a clear destination. In early spring, people often walked this way, not toward something, but away from the weight of their own thoughts. The light faded slowly, not suddenly, and the silence deepened with every step. He turned toward the far end of the street, where houses stood farther apart and the air felt heavier. People rarely lingered there, not because of fear, because of habit. One house stood slightly apart from the rest, abandoned. It had retreated from the road, as though unwilling to take part in the present. The fence leaned inward, its boards warped by time. The gate hung crooked on a single hinge, untouched for years. The windows were dark, clouded by dust and neglect, giving the house a distant, almost blind appearance. Thomas had passed it countless times. Everyone had. But that evening, something made him stop. In one of the windows, there was light. Not bright, not sharp, a steady, warm glow, the kind left by someone who did not expect to be noticed. Thomas stood still. He did not feel fear. He did not feel surprise. Only a quiet shift inside his chest, as if the evening had suddenly grown deeper, heavier than it had been moments before. That house had been empty for years. Everyone knew that. And that was precisely why the light should not have been there.
The light did not disappear when Thomas looked away. That unsettled him more than if it had flickered or gone out. He took a few steps forward, then stopped again, as though crossing an invisible line might change something he was not ready to name. The glow in the window remained steady, patient, indifferent to whether anyone noticed it or not. He turned his head slowly, scanning the street. Nothing else had changed. The same quiet houses, the same fences sinking into the damp earth. Somewhere farther down the road, a door closed softly. Life went on, untouched. Thomas forced himself to continue walking. His steps sounded louder than usual on the wet ground. Each footfall pressed into the earth with a faint, hollow sound, as if the road itself were listening. He told himself there was a simple explanation: someone passing through, a relative returning, a mistake. Yet the village had taught him something over the years. Simple explanations rarely arrived without being asked. By the time he reached the bend in the road, he noticed he was no longer alone in his awareness. A figure stood near a fence ahead, Margaret, wrapped in a dark shawl, her hands folded against her chest. She was not looking at Thomas when he approached. Her gaze was fixed on the same place his had been moments before. "You see it too," she said quietly, without turning. "Yes," Thomas answered. They stood side by side, not close enough to touch, not far enough to pretend they were alone. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. "That house hasn't had light in years," she said, "not since Eleanor." She said the name carefully, as one handles something fragile. Thomas nodded. He had heard it before, not often, not openly. Eleanor belonged to that category of people the village remembered without discussing, as though memory itself could be disturbed by words. "Maybe someone's come back," Thomas offered, though he did not believe it. Margaret exhaled slowly. "People don't come back like that, not quietly." A few steps away, a gate creaked. Henry stepped onto the road, wiping his hands on his coat. He followed their line of sight, squinting slightly. "So it's true," he muttered. "I thought it was just talk." "What talk?" Thomas asked. Henry hesitated, then shrugged. "Nothing solid, just people saying things, that the light's been there before. Not every night, only sometimes." Margaret shifted her weight. "Only when the evenings are like this, still, heavy." They fell silent again. No one suggested going closer. No one suggested knocking. The house seemed to hold its ground, unmoved by attention. As dusk deepened, more people slowed as they passed. Some glanced quickly and looked away. Others stopped longer than necessary, pretending to adjust a sleeve or retie a boot. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed. The village was doing what it always did best, watching without deciding. Thomas eventually walked home, but the light followed him in thought. Later that night, he found himself standing at his window, staring into the dark, waiting for something, though he could not have said what. When he finally lay down, sleep came slowly. In his half-dream, he saw the abandoned house as it once had been, curtains drawn, a lamp glowing softly, a table set for two. He woke before the image settled, his heart beating a little faster than usual. Outside, the village remained quiet, and somewhere, in a house that should have been empty, the light waited.
The light did not appear the next night. That absence unsettled Thomas more than its presence had. He found himself glancing toward the abandoned house without meaning to, half expecting the familiar glow to be waiting for him again. But the windows remained dark, their glass dull and lifeless, reflecting nothing but the deepening sky. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it all. The village moved through the day as it always did. Someone repaired a fence near the bend in the road. Children's voices drifted briefly from a distant yard before fading. The earth dried slightly under the weak sun, releasing a heavier scent of soil and last year's leaves. Spring was arriving, but carefully, as though it did not wish to disturb anything that had settled too deeply. Thomas told himself the light had been a coincidence, a mistake, a trick of the evening. But by late afternoon, he noticed something else. People were watching, not openly, not together,
One by one, as if by instinct, they slowed their steps when they reached that part of the street. They lingered longer than necessary. A woman stood at her gate with an empty bucket. A man leaned on his shovel, forgetting his work. No one spoke about it directly, yet the silence between them carried weight. That evening, as dusk folded itself gently over the village, the light returned. It came on later than before, after most windows had already gone dark. A soft glow bloomed behind the dusty glass, steady and calm, as though it had never left. Thomas saw it from the far end of the road and felt the same quiet tightening in his chest. This time he did not walk alone. Near the old pear tree stood Walter, his tall frame slightly bent with age, his hands clasped behind his back. He had lived in the village longer than most, long enough to remember things others preferred to forget. When Thomas approached, Walter did not turn his head. "It's back," Walter said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "Yes," Thomas replied. Walter nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already known. "They always come back, the things we leave unfinished." Thomas studied the house again. The light seemed unchanged, untouched by time. It did not flicker, it did not dim. "Do you know who's lighting it?" Thomas asked. Walter did not answer right away. He shifted his weight, pressing his boot into the soft earth, leaving a shallow mark behind. "I know who used to," he said at last. The air grew heavier. Somewhere nearby, a bird startled and took flight, its wings cutting sharply through the quiet. Walter turned slightly toward Thomas, enough for his lined face to catch the faint glow spilling from the window. That house wasn't always empty, and when it was last lived in, the light meant something very specific. Thomas waited. He had learned that Walter spoke only when words were ready. It meant someone was inside, and that someone was not meant to be seen. The light seemed brighter then, not in intensity, but in presence, as though it listened. More people gathered, though none admitted to doing so. Margaret stood near the fence again, her shawl pulled tighter. Henry lingered at a distance, arms crossed, watching with a frown he did not bother to hide. A few others paused farther back, pretending to talk, pretending not to stare. "This isn't right. We shouldn't let this go on." "And what exactly is this?" Margaret asked quietly. Henry opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were things easier to sense than to name. Walter stepped forward a single pace. "That light was once a promise." A murmur moved through the small group, barely audible. "A promise of what?" someone asked. Walter's gaze never left the window. "Of safety," he answered, "for one man and for one woman who chose to stand alone." Thomas felt the weight of those words settle slowly. He understood now why the light appeared only on certain evenings. It did not follow days or weather. It followed memory. As darkness fully claimed the sky, the glow remained steady, refusing to explain itself. No one approached the house. No one turned away. They stood together in quiet recognition, each carrying their own piece of the past, whether they wished to or not. And for the first time, Thomas realized an unsettling thing. The light was not asking to be extinguished. It was waiting to be answered.
The decision was not made all at once. It never is. At first, it existed only as a thought, passing, unspoken, drifting from one person to another like a faint draft through an open door. People carried it home with them, set it down beside their evening meals, lay awake with it long after the lamps were out. Something had to be done. No one said exactly what. The light appeared again 2 nights later. By then, its presence no longer surprised anyone. Instead, it unsettled them in a different way, like a question repeated too many times to ignore. Thomas noticed the change in the village before anyone admitted it. Doors closed earlier. Conversations ended abruptly when someone mentioned the house. Even the children seemed quieter, their games drifting farther from that end of the street. That evening, the air was thick with moisture. The ground held the warmth of the day, releasing it slowly as night settled in. Thomas stood near the bend in the road, watching the familiar glow take shape behind the dusty glass. This time, Henry did not keep his distance. He stepped forward, boots pressing firmly into the earth, and stopped where the road narrowed. "We can't just stand here every night," he said, louder than necessary. "This isn't normal." Margaret folded her arms tighter around herself. "Normal left this place a long time ago," she replied. Henry ignored her. His gaze stayed fixed on the house. "What if someone's living there?" he continued. "What if something's wrong? Or worse, what if this is meant to stir things up?" Walter, who had arrived quietly as always, leaned on his cane. "Stirring up doesn't make something false. Sometimes it makes it visible." Henry scoffed. "Visible to whom?" Walter did not answer. He did not need to. The light seemed to pulse softly, not flickering, but deepening, as if it were aware of the words spoken around it. Thomas felt a tension in his chest, a tightening that came from knowing a moment was approaching. He had felt it before, years ago, when choices were made without asking him, and when silence had seemed easier than standing apart. "We should check the house," Henry said suddenly. "Tonight." The words landed heavily. Margaret turned toward him. "Check it how?" Henry hesitated only briefly. "Go inside. See if anyone's there. If not, we put an end to this." Walter straightened slightly. "And if there is?" he asked. Henry's jaw tightened. "Then we'll deal with it." The group fell silent. Thomas looked from one face to another. He saw fear, yes, but also something else. Weariness, the kind that comes from carrying an unspoken burden for too long. "I'll go," Thomas said quietly. Several heads turned toward him. "I'm not saying we end anything, but we don't decide from the road." Walter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's fair," he said. Henry exhaled sharply, but did not argue. They approached the house together, slowly, as if the ground itself required permission. The fence creaked faintly when Thomas touched it. The gate resisted for a moment before yielding with a dull, tired sound. Up close, the house felt smaller than it had from a distance, less imposing, more human. The door was closed. Thomas lifted his hand, hesitated, then knocked once. The sound echoed softly inside. Nothing happened. He knocked again. From within there came a faint movement, a shuffle, a pause. The light behind the window did not change. Thomas felt his breath catch. Someone was there, and whatever waited behind that door was no longer content to remain unseen. The knock seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. Thomas kept his hand near the door, not touching it again, but not letting it fall either. The wood beneath his knuckles felt old, uneven, worn smooth by years of weather and neglect. For a moment, he wondered whether the sound he had heard inside was only his own breathing. Then the door moved. Not quickly, not fully. It opened just enough to let a thin line of warm light spill onto the ground, cutting through the damp darkness like a quiet confession. The glow revealed the threshold, cracked, uneven, softened by countless footsteps that had once crossed it daily. A man stood inside. He was older than Thomas had expected. His hair was gray, not white, his shoulders slightly rounded, as if they had learned to carry weight without complaint. He did not look startled. If anything, he looked prepared, as though this moment had arrived exactly when he knew it would. "You don't need to come in," the man said calmly. His voice was steady, unhurried, carrying none of the tension that pressed against the small group outside. Henry shifted his weight behind Thomas. "You've been lighting the lamp," Henry said. "People noticed." The man nodded once. "I assumed they would." Thomas stepped forward slightly, enough to meet the man's eyes. "Why?" he asked. The man studied him for a moment, then opened the door wider. Warm air escaped the house, carrying the faint scent of oil, old wood, and dried herbs, a smell that belonged to another time. "My name is Daniel, and I was hoping someone would ask that question." They did not enter all at once. One by one they crossed the threshold, their steps slow, cautious, as though the floor itself deserved respect. Inside, the house was quieter than expected, clean but not untouched. A table stood near the window, a single lamp resting upon it. A chair was pulled back, as if someone had only just risen. "This place was supposed to stay empty," Henry said, looking around. Daniel nodded again. "It did, for a long time." Walter, who had followed last, stopped near the doorway. The moment Daniel looked at him, something changed in his expression. Not shock, but recognition. "You remember," Daniel said. Walter's grip tightened on his cane. "I do. I never forgot." Daniel turned his gaze to the others. "I don't live here," he said. "I come only in the evenings, only when the light is needed." Margaret folded her hands together. "Needed for what?" she asked. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the window, where the lamp cast its steady glow into the night. "For courage," he said quietly. The room felt smaller then, not cramped, intimate. The walls held echoes of conversations long past, of footsteps that no longer crossed the floor. Daniel reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of cloth, carefully wrapped. "I owe my life to a woman who lived here. Her name was Eleanor." The name settled heavily among them. "She hid me, fed me, gave me time when time was the only thing I needed." Henry opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. "When they came for me," Daniel went on, "she did not deny it. She stood between me and the door and said, 'If you take him, you take me too.'" Silence filled the room. "They took her," Daniel said, "and they let me go." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "And the light?" he asked. Daniel looked at the lamp. "She left it burning that night, so I would know when it was safe to leave, so I would not be alone in the dark." He met their eyes again. "I promised myself I would return, not to stay,
not to disturb, just to make sure that what she did would not be forgotten. Outside, the village remained quiet. Inside, the light continued to burn, not as a mystery anymore, but as a living memory. And for the first time, no one asked Daniel to put it out.
They did not leave the house right away. The truth Daniel had spoken did not demand immediate answers. It settled slowly, like dust after something long closed has been disturbed. The lamp on the table burned steadily, its flame barely moving, as if it too understood that haste would only cheapen what had been revealed. Thomas leaned against the wall, feeling the unevenness of the old plaster beneath his palm. The house was warmer than the night outside, but not because of fire or insulation. It carried the warmth of intention, of someone who had once lived here with purpose. Margaret moved closer to the window. She lifted the edge of the curtain and looked out into the darkness where the village lay scattered and quiet. "They never told us," she said softly, "about Eleanor, about what really happened." Daniel nodded. "They didn't need to," he replied. "People often believe silence is kinder than truth." Walter shifted his stance near the door. "And sometimes it is, until it isn't." The words lingered between them. Outside, a distant dog barked once, then fell silent. The village felt suddenly farther away, as though this house now existed in its own small pocket of time. Henry broke the quiet. "So you come back," he said, not unkindly now, but with a rough honesty, "to keep a promise?" "Yes," Daniel answered, "and to remind myself that courage existed here once, that it wasn't a story people invented later." Henry looked down at the floor, tracing a crack in the wood with the toe of his boot. "And what happens now?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Thomas felt the weight of the question more heavily than he expected. Until that moment, the light was someone else's responsibility. Daniel's, Eleanor's, the past's. Now it hovered between them all, unclaimed. "When people start talking, this won't stay quiet," Margaret said. "It already hasn't," Daniel said, giving a faint smile. They stepped outside together at last. The cool night air met them gently, carrying the scent of damp earth and budding branches. From the road, the house looked different now, smaller, perhaps, but no longer empty. The next morning, the village woke differently. Not louder, not brighter, just aware. Thomas noticed it in small things, a longer pause at the well, a conversation that stopped when someone approached, then resumed more thoughtfully. Walter stood outside his house longer than usual, watching people pass, with an expression that was not quite concern, not quite relief. By afternoon, the story had taken shape, not perfectly, not truthfully in every detail, but close enough to matter. Eleanor's name returned to the village. Some spoke it with reverence, others with discomfort, a few with quiet shame. Thomas heard it whispered near the shop, murmured at fences, spoken aloud for the first time in years. That evening, the light appeared again. This time, Thomas noticed something new. People did not stop at a distance. They came closer. Not all of them, not together, but one by one, villagers slowed, stood, looked. Some crossed themselves. Some nodded, as if greeting someone they had once known, but never properly acknowledged. No one knocked. No one asked Daniel to explain again. The light no longer felt like a question. It felt like an answer that had arrived too late, and yet, somehow, still in time. Thomas stood at the edge of the road and realized something quietly profound. The light had not returned to change the past. It had returned to test the present. And the village was still deciding how to respond.
The step was small, so small that at first almost no one noticed it. It happened the following afternoon when the sky hung low and pale, and the air carried that quiet expectancy that comes before rain. Thomas was returning from the far end of the village when he saw Margaret standing near the abandoned house, a basket resting against her hip. She did not look uncertain. She lifted the crooked gate with both hands, testing its weight, then propped it open with a stone. The sound echoed softly, wood against earth, louder than it should have been. A few people slowed their pace. No one spoke. Margaret stepped inside the yard and set the basket down. From it, she took a cloth, folded and clean, and wiped the dust from the windowsill beneath the lamp. Her movements were careful, respectful, as if she were in someone else's home, which, in a way, she was. Thomas stopped at the edge of the road. Walter watched from farther back, his cane planted firmly in the ground. Henry arrived moments later, carrying a bundle of boards under one arm. "I didn't plan this," Henry muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, "but that fence won't stand another season." Margaret glanced up. "It doesn't need to be perfect," she said, "just honest." Henry nodded once and set to work, straightening what could be straightened, tightening what had loosened with time. His hands moved with familiar certainty. The fence responded. Others came closer. A woman brought water. A man cleared debris from the yard. Someone fixed the hinge on the gate so it no longer groaned in protest. No one announced their intention. No one asked permission. They worked quietly. When evening came, the house looked much the same, still old, still marked by absence, but no longer neglected. The path to the door was clear. The yard stood open. And when the light appeared that night, it met something new. Witness. Daniel stood just inside the doorway, watching the small gathering form outside. He did not speak. He did not thank anyone. His eyes followed each movement, each choice, as though committing them carefully to memory. Walter stepped forward at last. "It won't stop here," he said, his voice low but steady. "Once you do one thing openly, the rest will follow." Daniel nodded. That's how it began before, one person refusing to look away. Thomas felt the truth of that settle deep within him. Later, as people drifted back to their homes, Margaret lingered. She shouldn't be remembered only for what was taken from her. She should be remembered for what she gave. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. That's all I ever hoped for. That night, Thomas did not stand at the edge of the road. He stepped into the yard, and the light did not waver. The change did not please everyone. At first, it showed itself quietly, in glances held a little too long, in voices lowered when certain names were spoken, in doors that closed more firmly than before. The village had accepted the light as memory, but memory was safe only as long as it asked nothing in return. One morning, Thomas noticed the gate at the abandoned house standing open again,
not propped carefully, but pushed wide as if by impatience. Fresh footprints marked the soft earth, careless and deep. The cloth Margaret had laid on the windowsill lay crumpled near the fence, damp with mud. Inside the yard, something else had changed. The lamp was gone. Not broken, not damaged, simply gone. Word spread quickly, faster than the truth ever had. People gathered in low clusters, voices overlapping, fragments of thought spilling into the air. Someone took it. It shouldn't have been left there. This was bound to happen. Daniel arrived before evening, his steps slower than usual. He stood in the doorway, staring at the empty table where the lamp had rested night after night. The room felt colder without it, stripped of its quiet center. "They didn't want it," Henry said, uneasy. "They wanted it gone." Walter leaned heavily on his cane. "Light has a way of doing that," he murmured. "It shows more than people ask for." As dusk approached, the house remained dark. For the first time in weeks, the road did not slow. People passed as they always had, relieved by the familiar absence. The village exhaled. Thomas felt something tighten painfully inside him. That night, rain began to fall, slow at first, then steady, soaking the ground, darkening the fields, washing the last pale traces of day from the sky. Thomas lay awake, listening to it strike the roof, imagining the house standing empty again, returned to silence. Then he saw it. Not from the abandoned house, but from another window. A small light flickered at the far end of the street, then another and another. One by one, lamps appeared in homes that had long kept their evenings dim. Not bright, not announced, just enough to be seen. Margaret's house glowed softly. Walter's window followed. Even Henry's, usually dark by nightfall, held a faint square of warmth. Thomas rose and lit his own lamp. No one had said a word. No one had planned it. Yet the village, in its quiet way, had answered. Daniel stood outside again that night, watching the scattered lights across the road. Rain dampened his coat, but he did not move. "They thought they could take it away," he said softly when Thomas joined him. "They didn't understand." Thomas followed his gaze. "They didn't need the lamp. They needed the reminder." The abandoned house remained dark, but the village did not. And for the first time, the light no longer belonged to one place. It belonged to many. The lamp was returned before dawn. No one saw who brought it back. Thomas found it standing on the table when he came to the house the next morning. Clean, intact, its glass wiped carefully, as though the hands that placed it there wished to undo not only the act of taking, but the intention behind it. Daniel stood nearby, looking tired but calm. "They understood," he said quietly. "Not all of them, but enough." Outside, the village was waking slowly. The rain had passed, leaving the air fresh and clear. Puddles reflected pale morning light, and the first birds called hesitantly from the hedges, unsure whether the day was truly ready to begin. That evening, the lamp burned again. But something had changed. People did not gather in silence anymore. They spoke softly. They lingered. Someone placed fresh flowers near the fence. Nothing formal, just branches cut from a garden nearby. Another repaired a loose board on the porch without being asked. Walter arrived just before dusk. "It won't last forever," he said to Daniel, not unkindly. Daniel nodded. "I know," he replied. "It was never meant to." They stood together for a while, watching the light grow stronger as night settled in. Later that week, Daniel prepared to leave. He packed little, only what he had brought with him. On his final evening, he extinguished the lamp himself, slowly, deliberately. The house fell into darkness, but it was not the same darkness as before. The village noticed. No one panicked. No one felt loss. Instead, lamps burned steadily in windows across the road, not because they were afraid of the dark, but because they understood what the light had asked of them. Daniel paused at the gate. "She would have liked this," he said. Thomas nodded. "She was already here, through all of you." Daniel smiled faintly, then turned and walked away, his figure fading into the soft evening air. The abandoned house remained, still old, still quiet, but it no longer felt forgotten. It stood as it always had, bearing witness. And on certain evenings, when the air grew heavy and the light softened, Thomas would swear he saw a faint glow in the window, not from a lamp, from memory, from choice, from the understanding that light does not need to last forever, only long enough to be passed on.
Thank you for spending this evening with us. If this story left you feeling warm, support the video with a like and share a few words in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to return to stories around the campfire.